You've seen certain progressive countries in the Nordic region, for example, countries like Finland, countries like Sweden, countries like Norway, who understand, by the way, very, very well, better than most, the most sophisticated, the most elaborate, and the most expensive cyber defenses collapse when a traveling business person leaves his or her laptop in a taxi. That's what we need to work on, Georgina.
Charles, it's a pleasure to have you here on Visionary. Welcome.
Georgina, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
In your book, you take us back to a time when Russia was in flux, a country on the brink. You describe it as a moment when criminals roamed the streets and strolled the corridors of power. Opportunity was everywhere. Charles, paint us a picture of what that moment was really like. You lived through it. How did it feel?
Well, Georgina, your description at the very beginning of the podcast of how Moscow felt in the 1990s makes me think that you had just gotten off a plane returning from Moscow at the time. You're absolutely right. This was a society in the making, politically, economically, and socially, starting from a Soviet hangover, but in a way with a clean slate, trying to do things as they've never been done before. There was indeed, as you point out, an absolute gold rush mentality from the perspective of business. This was a time of emerging markets. Russia was one of the biggest, one of the most attractive. It became known as the Wild East because of its lawless atmosphere and just general sort of sizzling energy of opportunity. I should also point out that this is at the time when we were still using, if memory serves correctly, things like dial-up modems and phone connections, and the technology that we used to communicate into and out of Russia was fairly primitive.
Was there a belief that if Russia could build a prosperous middle class, they would evolve into a stable Western-style democracy, one that couldn't afford to go back to war?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are a couple of assumptions that international politicians and international business people were making about Russia. And the first one is that with enough time and enough money, Russia would become just like us, that they would integrate into the global economy, share the same political goals and economic aspirations, and, take a seat at the table with the rest of the grown-ups and behave accordingly. There's also a theory that says as countries develop a middle class, they evolve legally to protect the property and the rights and the assets that middle class acquires. That was an assumption that we probably should have checked a bit more vigorously as the political scene developed.
So, I mean, with an emerging middle class, when it takes shape, is there a sense also that economic prosperity is the way to foster goodwill and collaboration with the West?
Well, that's right. I mean, politicians all around the world, but particularly from the West and from G7 and some G20 nations, were telling us to embrace Russia, to welcome Russia into the community of nations, the new Russia. And they were telling their business people, their sort of economic elite, to go to Russia. These were the business diplomats, the merchant diplomats of that era. And they were saying, go, invest in Russia, bind it to our international capitalist system, and a peaceful Russia is a non-threatening Russia.
But then, of course, as you say in the book, it was all over, even more brutally than it began. What led to that unraveling?
For anybody who was paying attention or who wanted to look closely enough, and of course I'm saying this with the benefit of hindsight, and that's a luxury that we have, but we try to use fairly sparingly. But if we were looking closely, there were signs about Russia's direction with the beginning of the Putin administration. And that is sort of his handling of certain political incidents, his nationalization of the oil major company Yukos, and the fact that by the middle of the early 20s, the early 2000s, the role of the state in the economy was becoming dominant, so much so that at a certain point, more than 50% of Russia's GDP was generated by state-owned strategic enterprises. And lastly, I should say that in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin gave a landmark speech where he declared that he was no longer interested in a system dominated by Western liberal democracies and open markets and capitalism. He said this really wasn't his cup of tea anymore, and that Russia wasn't benefiting from it and was going to move away from it.
So basically, under Putin, when he came to power, there was this notion that oligarchs could keep their empires intact if they stayed out of politics. But as you point out, it was simply a return to a system where the state quietly controlled everything.
That's right. Part of the early 2000s was a correction of the lawlessness of the 1990s. And to keep the oligarchs under control, Putin struck a deal with them. And he said, as long as your business interests remain aligned with the state's strategic interests, then I won't push too hard on you. Go and make your money, but stay within the lines that I'm drawing. Any stepping outside of the lines would be met with fairly swift and severe economic and political punishment.
So, okay, stepping back, there's always been a shadow world operating alongside business in Russia, and that, of course, is espionage. So back then, it was about intelligence gathering and old-school spying. Before we get into exactly how that worked in Russia, I just want you to perhaps talk a little bit about how espionage is nothing new.
That's right, Georgina. Espionage was mentioned in the Bible. And we're told that spies and intelligence gathering and counterintelligence appears in literature going back as far as the 4th century BC. The Greeks, the Romans, the Aztecs, apparently, were all believed to use what we would now call spies, and they were all about gathering information about political and military rivals, and they also employed counterintelligence because they knew the enemy was up to it too.
Well, so looking at Russia, how did that espionage, that shadow world, coexist with the burgeoning business landscape?
Right. Well, a couple of interesting things happened, and that is that the Soviet Union has always had an enormous international and powerful intelligence service. What happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union was a fairly significant reforming of that organization, and then to a certain degree, a privatization of espionage in the Russian Federation. And that is in the number of alumni from the Soviet intelligence agencies that went into business on their own. And they were involved in commercial espionage on behalf of Russian companies. Some of them went to work in the security departments of Western companies. And there were parallel and sometimes overlapping structures between what was going on inside at the famous Lubyanka and what was going on inside carpeted boardrooms in Russian companies.
Of course, espionage looks very different now. Russia has become a major player in hacking and in cyber warfare. How has that evolution shaped the way that business and geopolitics interact?
That's right. A few important things have happened as modern espionage techniques and tactics evolved. I mean, you'll recall that some of the most high-profile espionage incidents in the United States, for example, involved the detection of spies leaving briefcases of documents under park benches in Washington parks. That's all very good for John le Carré novels. But these days, you're more likely to see all of this happen in cyberspace. And both in official, unofficial, public, private, and criminal sectors, you have teams of cyber activists, hacktivists, and spies accessing, gathering, analyzing, and transferring enormous amounts of data, sometimes at the behest of the private sector, sometimes at the behest of companies, with a grasp and a reach that really is unfathomable to most of us now.
So how much of Russia's cyber warfare strategy is about economic gain versus political or military dominance?
There will always be strategic state requirements that are satisfied by intelligence. There will be economic incentives to gathering information, to hacking. And this is when you see things like ransomware. When you see a ransomware attack, you can feel relatively certain that there are commercial aims behind that sort of damage. Because first of all, there'll be a ransom to pay, in some cases of a sizable amount. And usually that ransom is held against the extraction of highly valuable data, whether it's banking consumers or commercial trade secrets, or just people's PIN numbers and passcodes for their bank accounts. That's a commercial operation. What we have seen in parallel to all of this has been a slight reorientation of Russia's strategic cyber espionage operations in support of the war in Ukraine. That's really changed a lot of where Russia is pointing its resources, a lot of what it's doing, and a lot of its strategic aims on the ground.
On the business side, though, which sectors do you think are particularly vulnerable to these kinds of cyber threats today?
Yeah, you can imagine the list of sort of strategic enterprises and high-tech enterprises. And this could be anything from energy companies, pharma companies, chip makers, software engineers, software designers and companies, the world's Microsofts and the Oracles, mobile phone companies, critical national infrastructure, the national grids of countries all around the world. And increasingly now and more recently, Russian intelligence is tracking subsea cables and the sort of new modern infrastructure that's rising. I mean, bear in mind, Georgina, that as we're sitting here and talking, we are on the cusp of, or in the very early days of the fourth industrial revolution. And what is the fourth industrial revolution based on? It's based on data, it's based on artificial intelligence, it's based on machine learning and tech. Gone are the sort of coal-fired factories of previous industrial revolutions. And the footprint of the fourth industrial revolution is enormous, and a lot of it is vulnerable to cyber espionage.
Where do you see the greatest need for innovation when it comes to defense strategies?
So the skills gap in the public sector and the private sector is enormous and growing. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to educate a new generation of tech-savvy entrepreneurs, coders, programmers, cybersecurity specialists. And that is a huge category of people who work both on hardware and who work on software and who work on penetration testing and who are into the physical security. Because the one thing that we should emphasize, no matter how high tech we get, it's always the human factor that is the weakest link. And so training of people and the awareness of the threats and the risks in the cyber landscape is absolutely critical to closing this skills gap. And then, of course, there's a technology gap that needs to be closed. And this is just an ever-evolving industry. In some cases, the cyber criminals are ahead of us. In some cases, they're behind us. But in both cases, they're smart. And we need to constantly stay a step ahead of them in terms of arming our global cyber footprint against their intrusion.
Is the increasing threat of cyber warfare likely to drive growth in Western cybersecurity industries? And which regions then, or countries, do you think are best positioned to capitalize on that growth?
So, Georgina, according to research that I've found online, the cybersecurity market is expected to witness absolutely exponential growth in the coming years. By the end of this year, 2025, the cybersecurity industry is expected to be worth globally more than $203 billion. And that's broken into dozens of subsegments, each of which is anticipated to grow. And in fact, by 2029, there are figures that say the market volume of cybersecurity and its associated industries will grow to $271 billion. And so you can see that this is an industry poised to grow in lockstep with the growth of data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and everything that you and I are doing on a daily basis online.
So, I mean, as you say, there's a huge need for growing expertise in the field. What opportunities are there for businesses in training, in education, in workforce development?
That's right. So according to the UK government, the proportion of UK businesses that have basic or advanced technical skills needs to catch up quite a bit. The UK government estimates that 44% of UK businesses have a gap in the skills that they need to confront the threats on the cybersecurity front and in cyber world going forward. There are 27% of British companies that have a gap in advanced cybersecurity skills. These are companies, for example, that are not doing penetration testing. Now, companies can resolve these issues in lots of different ways. They can develop in-house expertise to defend themselves proactively and retrospectively against threats that they anticipate and threats that are currently materializing. Or there is anticipated enormous growth in the consultancy services sector, where companies that don't necessarily have the in-house capacity to do, say, their own penetration testing, you can outsource this. But that sector needs to grow as well. In the education sector, in the UK, there are 74 UK universities, this is government data, providing cybersecurity undergraduate courses, and a slightly larger number providing postgraduate courses in the UK. This is only a small growth, though, over previous statistics. This number needs to grow, if not just in size, but certainly in scope.
I wonder then, from your experience, what it is you think that Western governments and businesses can learn from the way that Russia has approached hybrid warfare and its use of digital tools.
Yeah, there's an interesting point in all of this, Georgina, about the relationship between governments and companies. And we'll see how this goes in the future. But the signals coming out of the United States not too long ago was that companies are on their own. There used to be a time when the government would protect everyone, all of its citizens, in inverted commas, against cyber hostility and cyber threats. Governments are busy enough on their own now, protecting themselves from hostile cyber actors. And the message to companies is, sort yourselves out. The government is not going to provide the umbrella that you need to hide under in the event of a massive cyber attack. This is a signal to the private sector to grow and develop and to protect itself.
I mean, do you think that the current geopolitical tensions are driving real innovation in cybersecurity, or are we, and it would seem this way, mostly playing catch up?
So, we've been taught that warfare and conflict typically involves soldiers and tanks and missiles. And what we know now in an age of hybrid warfare is that conflict, whether it's armed or not, involves enormous operations in the cyber universe. And that includes everything from misinformation, disinformation, election interference, good old vanilla cyber hacking, and a diverse sort of toolkit that a tense geopolitical world is deploying with increasing frequency and increasing effectiveness. The most secure states and the most secure companies are not the ones with the biggest tanks or the highest walls. They're the ones with the most diverse array of defenses against a hybrid threat, and that includes malicious cyber activity.
So looking at hybrid threats then, what do you think the next frontier for Russia's hybrid warfare against the West might look like? And are there any areas in which businesses and governments need to act now to stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think that there are two things. Again, we'll divide this into sort of what Russia needs to do to maintain its current advantage in the war on Ukraine. And that will include the use of cyber hostility against critical national infrastructure in Ukraine. It will involve the hacking of government agencies. It will be the disabling of the technology that Ukraine requires to wage the war. But let's not forget that the war in Ukraine has been labeled by Russia basically as a proxy war against the West. Russia now is interested in creating an alternative political, military, and economic space to the West. And anything that it can do to weaken the Western alliance, it will undertake. And that will involve the deployment of destabilizing activities in the data sphere, in the cyber universe. There was the famous accusations of election interference in the 2016 election in the United States from Russia. As Russia seeks allies in the non-aligned world. It will be launching cyber activities along disinformation and misinformation to shape new alliances against the West. And the threat is always there against pipelines, against national grids, against shipping, against aviation, heavy industry, and, semiconductor manufacturing. I mean, we've seen Russia deploy techniques like spoofing, which means that you can't find the shadow fleet that's shipping Russian oil anymore because they turn off their transponders or they use the transponders to make them look like they're somewhere where they're not. Russia's also penetrated some of our aviation protection by making airplanes look like they're in places where they're not, and also by turning off transponders on their own military aircraft. The entire, without sounding too pessimistic or too alarmist, land, sea, and air are all equally vulnerable.
So how is this reshaping the global business world? And are companies becoming more cautious about engaging with certain markets because of these cyber threats?
I think companies have finally realized, Georgina, that these sorts of topics that we're discussing have moved from a nice to know or nice to have feature to an absolute must know, must have feature. I mean, the problem, or the challenge, I should say, to companies with a global footprint is trying to navigate this patchwork of threats coming from Russia, threats coming from China, threats coming from our own allies sometimes, as was exemplified in the WikiLeaks hack. When you are a global company, you have activities that either are based in or cross through countries that may not have aligned political and economic interests. Those are the hot spots where companies have to protect themselves most carefully. I think that in an unpredictable, geopolitically hot world where cyber is the newest and the most recent and the potentially most damaging arena of conflict, companies who are across all of this really need to just keep their eyes open and their tech critically up to date.
Charles, finally, if you're going to offer one piece of advice to international policymakers to counteract these threats, what would it be?
Georgina, I'm going to go back to something that I mentioned a little bit earlier in the podcast, and that is that no matter what we have on our laptops, no matter what we have on our servers, no matter what we have protecting our national grid, it's the human factor. The policy arena has got to be oriented towards certain levels of civil cyber awareness. You've seen certain progressive countries in the Nordic region, for example, countries like Finland, countries like Sweden, countries like Norway, who understand, by the way, very, very well, better than most, the nature of the cyber threat from Russia. These are countries that are educating their children how to detect misinformation and how to be safe online. And so the most sophisticated, the most elaborate, and the most expensive cyber defenses collapse when a traveling business person leaves his or her laptop in a taxi. That's what we need to work on, Georgina.
Charles, thank you. What a wonderful analogy at the end. Charles Hecker, thank you. Charles's book is called Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia, and it's on shelves now at all good bookshops. This has been Visionary. I'm Georgina Godwin. Until next time, goodbye.